Welcome, everyone. My name is Joan Jenkinson. I'm the Executive Director of the Black Screen Office. Today, I would like to honor the land that we're on, which has been the site of human activity since time immemorial. The Black Screen Office is headquartered on the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and more recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. The Being Seen report is the project of consultations that have been held across the country with Black, people of color, 2S LGBTQIA, and people with disabilities. There are over 400 individuals who participated in focus groups and in one-on-one interviews. So the result of all of this consultation is our key directives that are meant to be used by everyone in the creative and decision-making process. So in the Canadian film, television, and digital media industries. And we want them to use it to educate themselves, to develop strategies for change, and to enact real, long-lasting systemic transformation. The first report, the core report, was released in February, and that was followed by the Children's Media Report in March. And we're here today in solidarity with BIPOC TV and Film for the soon to be released report that focuses on people of color communities. These reports can be found on the beingseen.ca website, and there you'll find the reports as well as the directives, which are kind of cheat sheets for each of the reports that summarize all the key issues that have been addressed in the reports and that can be acted upon. I'm happy to welcome Kadon Douglas, the Executive Director of BIPOC TV and Film, who is our gracious host today. Co-host.
Hello, everyone. BIPOC TV and Film is thrilled to support this landmark research project from the Black Screen Office. We all know that to be seen, to be heard, and to be appreciated are core human needs. For too long, Black, Indigenous, and people of color have been silenced, erased, and marginalized in Canadian history and Canadian content. This has been a detriment to our communities, to our industry, and to the evolution of Canadian film and TV. We hope that people, especially producers, broadcasters, funders, distributors, take their time to read the study and not only read it, but put the directives into action. I'm really looking forward to the conversation here today. Thank you so much for the Black Screen Office for your leadership on this. So yes, I'd just like to pass it on now to our moderator, Shant Joshi.
Thanks, Kadon. Hi, my name is Shant Joshi. I'm Vice Chair of the Board of Directors for BIPOC TV and Film, as well as a producer and president of Faye Pictures. I'm pleased to be here today to moderate the session, Being Seen, People of Color Communities, Directives for Creating Authentic and Inclusive Content. We've brought together for this panel Kelly Lynne Ashton, who will talk about the research, and then 4 industry veterans from the 4 main communities that were featured in the research: South Asian, Southeast and East Asian, Latinx or Latine, and Brazilian and West Asian, to talk about their experiences and how the directives can be used as a tool to improve authenticity. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Kelly Lynne Ashton, lead researcher, Being Seen, Ashton Consulting, Rabiya Mansoor, screenwriter and producer, Leonard Chan, screenwriter and actor, Luisa Alvarez-Restrepo, project manager, Warner Media Access Canada, and Hoda Elatawi, producer, GAPC Entertainment. So Kelly Lynne, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, I'm happy to. So I just want to quickly go into the research because the key is to hear the voices of the people involved. It was initially inspired by Imaginative's Protocols and Pathways, which is an incredible guide for working with Indigenous communities, people's stories. And when I read that, I realized it would be so terrific if we had something similar for all the other underrepresented groups. I pitched Telefilm, they agreed, and they asked me to work with the Black Screen Office. And together, as Joan mentioned, we decided to put this research together to target Black, people of color, 2S LGBTQIA+, and people with disabilities. And, you know, like we've talked to so many people. We created safe spaces and took an intersectional approach so that in any of our consultations or focus groups or interviews, people could bring their full selves. And that allowed for some really terrific conversations, emotional conversations, and passion and anger and tears. And I really want to communicate that this is all really important to a lot of people. We were surprised by how many people participated, how many multiracial people participated, like myself. I didn't realize there were so many people like me out there. It's certainly not consistent with the Statistics Canada data. And there's, you know, a lot of people with multiple identities. So with all of our conversation here today, I've encouraged everybody to bring their full selves to the conversation. So the first report that came out, Core Themes, that was issues that applied to people regardless of their identity. So things like what is authentic storytelling, how to create more authentic casting, when is it your story to tell? And that is, as we know, a very complex issue. And we really dug into some of those issues. And I encourage everybody to, if you don't have time to read the report, download the directives. They will give you some guidance, not just on what to do, but also some of the questions to ask. And then the People of Color Communities report is the first of 4 community reports where we talk to communities and about what are the stereotypes, what are the ones that upset them, how do they want to break those down and be better reflected. So they're more focused reports. And I want to talk for a few minutes about how the sort of labels that we're using, from people of color down to the 4 buckets. They're not about identity, because people tend to identify by their specific origin, ethnic or a country of origin. They're really a research tool to aggregate the responses so that we separating people of color from Black, from 2S LGBTQIA+, and people with disabilities, but also within the people of color communities. One really good way of illustrating this is West Asians almost universally were upset that they only seem to be portrayed as terrorists or as oppressed hijabis. And that's something that's very distinct to that community. I'll also say that we use the term West Asian instead of Middle Eastern. And this is something that I learned through the research, that the term Middle Eastern was something created by the British Foreign Office and is therefore imperialist and colonial. The United Nations, a lot of their agencies are instead using the term West Asian because it's more geographic based. So I think that we're all learning, and terms such as, you know, West Asian or Middle Eastern are things that are evolving, and it's all about conversation. So I encourage people to read the report because we go into a bit more detail on some of the terms within the glossary and the core themes. But let's all just keep talking. With that, I'll hand it over to Shant.
Thanks, Lynne. I think we want to start off the conversation with these labels, markers that surround identity. I stumbled in my intro, if anyone noticed, on the term Latinx, because that has its own issues, which I know Luisa can talk a little bit about. And, just as Lynne was saying, West Asian, I've heard Southwest Asian, North African, Middle Eastern, North African, it's a whole variety of different identity markers. And I think it's important to have that conversation in this space, especially as I just got my email from CMF, update your persona ID. People are collecting the data, people are making an effort. I think it's important to note that people are making an effort to know who is being funded, to know who is receiving the funding, whose stories who are the people behind the stories being told. And it is important that we do understand that, but also I think speaking a little bit about the labeling, Luisa, do you want to sort of kick us off with sort of the conversation around Latinx as a term?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think what Lynne was saying, obviously, these labels help for data, but they're not always representative of how the community identifies. And, something like Latinx, this term originated from the US. And so for me, it's like, why are we as Canadians using that term? And we have to look into the communities themselves. Do they, identify with that term? And even looking at the US, I think only about a third of US Latin Americans are actually aware of this term. And then you get into a smaller percentage that prefer to use it. And so, it's having this conversation, like it is great, obviously, that the different bodies and everyone want to understand, as you're saying, Shant, is like, who are we funding? Who are the people behind these stories? But it is important to constantly engage with communities to understand how it is that they want to be represented. For me, something like Latinx, doesn't take into consideration the language of a lot of the people that are part of that community. And so if Spanish is your native language, in most cultures, you cannot pronounce Latinx unless you have English knowledge. And so I always think of my grandma, she was born in Colombia, only speaks Spanish. She cannot pronounce this. How can she identify as Latinx? And so it is really just thinking of where these terms are coming from, and also understanding that the default, just how Middle Eastern came from like the British office, and there's that colonial aspect to it. The default doesn't have to be kind of like this North American Western perspective. We're dealing with larger communities that come from different places. And so while it's always tricky and there isn't always this one specific answer, it is just engaging with the community to understand what are they looking for, and also that we're different. And so, a US Latin American person is very different from a Canadian Latin American person, and our lived experiences and barriers and challenges are different. So just having that, understanding that is like, this is the data term, but really how is this reflective of the community? And I think that can often be forgotten when we're looking to label and like really understand kind of how communities make up our, our society.
And Luisa, just to quickly follow up with you, one term that I've heard being used around that's a bit more inclusive is Latine, with the E with the accent aigu, and primarily Latinx came out from a need for acceptance of gender expression. So I'm curious if that's a word you've been using, or that's a word that you would, is more acceptable because it has, a vowelic sound. I'm not saying that correctly, but yeah.
No, definitely. I think, yeah, exactly. It is understanding like there's definitely the need for that more gender neutral term, but it's understanding that this is a language that is gendered. And so when you approach it from, an English perspective, like, well, just say this, like, well, you can't, because like native speakers can't say this, but 100% it is looking to the language, to the culture, to see what is possible. And so, for example, a word in Spanish, baby, is bebé. And like that ends in need. So it's the same thing where like it is taking these different approaches to like, what is more inclusive language, but rather than dictating to the culture, it is working with the culture and the community to find something exactly like Latine. And, this is a conversation that I have with my Latin American friends as well, where, why is it Latinx? And, why isn't it something that is more reflective of the culture and the language, and that is accessible to members of that community?
Thank you. And Hoda, I know we chatted a little bit about that shifting definition, or that shifting label from Middle Eastern to West Asian, Southwest Asian, North African. Sort of where are you on all that? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I knew I would do that. It wasn't really until I talked with Kellyanne that I'd heard that term West Asian, and I didn't realize it was an umbrella. It was an umbrella that included me. So it's interesting because you grow up with certain terminologies that are entrenched in defining who you are and your identity. So I've often defined myself as Arab Canadian, or I identify as Muslim. I have used the word Middle Eastern, or that I'm, or Arab, or from the Middle East, or MENA, Middle East, North Africa. So it also, these terminologies, you're right, Kellyanne, when you mentioned, there are things that we're just learning, and we also have to learn how they attach to our identity. But I was really happy to hear you sort of mention that to me, because at first I was like, I don't think I fit, and then she explained it to me. But for someone like myself, I identify both as an Arab and as a Muslim. So there's sort of two buckets there for me. So I can speak to that a little bit later.
Sweet. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to move over into stereotyping as part of the research. So one of the things that came out of the research was that some communities felt like there was so little representation that any representation was welcome, even if it felt stereotyped. So specifically referring to Mindy Kaling's Never Have I Ever as an example, some people saw it as a two-step process. First, get on the screen and then worry about authentic representation. Rabiya, I want to turn it to you. Why do you think that is the case? And does it have to be that way? And also, what tools do both creators and executives have to build representation authentically? I know this is something that we've been discussing this past week in the sphere of Canadiana.
Yeah. Well, I think, Never Have I Ever is a great example of a very polarizing show, because on one hand, I think having a dark-skinned South Asian female as the lead is very refreshing, considering all the colorism in the South Asian community. But on the other hand, I would say with all of Mindy Kaling's work, it speaks very much to who she is and her specific experiences, which are Indian, which are Hindu, and specifically upper class Brahmin experiences. And so that's all she really represents. And the problem with this is that, South Asia is so diverse. So it's we don't see as much Bengali representation, there was that whole issue about Tamil representation through Deepa Mehta's Funny Boy and all the issues around casting. And so I think the problem that we really run into is that broadcasters and executives are always commissioning the same few South Asians to create the same kind of content that they've done in the past, instead of giving more underrepresented communities who are not at that potentially same level, those kinds of opportunities. So I think when it comes to the tools that creators and executives have to build representation authentically, it's to really look at the market, and it's okay, who is being underserved right now? Because if we create a show, for example, centering a Muslim Bengali, that community hasn't seen representation. So that executive that commissioned something like that, it's going to be a risk, but there's also potential for great reward. And I think we just need to have more of those conversations about who's getting the money, and can it be allocated a little bit differently?
And speaking further into that authenticity element, so I'm an executive at a broadcasting company. Someone comes to me with a Bengali Muslim project, and I'm like, okay, great, this sounds really cool. Here's some money, go make your show. Is there any accountability on the side of the executive to actually ensure that this story is being told authentically? Who is the person that is pitching this project, and how are they building systems? Yeah,
I have so many thoughts about this, because there are so many Canadian shows that are diverse, but when you look at the creators, they are white creators. And I think a lot of folks, again, with Never Have I Ever, kind of justify it being oh, well, they're hiring people in the room who speak authentically to that experience. But it's why are they the showrunners? That's always a question I have. And I think that it's really important about, for Indigenous folks, they have the term narrative, sovereignty. And I think for people of color, it's we need to have narrative ownership over our own work that is very specific to our communities. And if we don't have that narrative ownership, like the executives should be held accountable for like, why is that show being greenlit over all the other pitches they got that were from people who authentically represent that community and who could have been given the skills and the leg up in order to be the showrunners to push those shows forward. Stop commissioning white creators for diverse stories. I'm done. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Hoda.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to speak to that was, I agreed with everything Rabiya said, and to your point that you mentioned, Shant, about in the research showing that certain communities were just happy to see themselves represented, even if it was a negative representation or a disrespectful one. I feel safe in saying that when it comes to representation of Arabs and Muslims, I don't think, certainly speaking for myself, I'm not happy at all with the representation. I'd rather not see it because, as we know, Arabs and Muslims are often represented as villains or victims or oppressed or hyper sexualized, or if it's if it's a hijabi woman, for example, somebody's got to save her and she's got to become free by taking off her hijab. Or if it's a male, if it's somebody who's rich, and a rich Arab is often someone who's characterized as someone who's nefarious and has nefarious dealings. From my standpoint, that representation is better left off the table altogether. To your point, Rabiya, in terms of who's making the shows, Shant, last time we spoke, we talked about, you came up with a wonderful term called collegial mentorship. And it's something that I really believe in. So for myself, who's an experienced, a documentary producer, I produce kids shows, but I have no experience in scripted comedy. And this is something that I'm developing. So I am looking to work with people who are seasoned, that can provide some mentorship, and that we can work in partnership. So that's one way perhaps of addressing that point that you made, Rabiya, in terms of letting our voices be heard and not overpowered, but having the support of people who have done the things that I haven't done before.
Yeah, because you're contributing in equal senses. One is contributing their experience in the industry, and one is contributing their story.
100%.
How are we weighting that, for sure? Especially in a top-down mentorship structure, which we've seen historically, basically, in this industry.
Shant, sorry, I just had a really quick, Rabiya, you mentioned like with an executive, like they keep greenlighting content that, stories that are not being told by us, but, they are the ones in a position to create a system where like we are being elevated. And so it's like, we can then just keep getting into the writers. So it's like, oh, okay. And so why are we not the showrunner if we keep being, taken into the writer's room? And so it is that sense of, what are we missing? You keep taking us for the writer's room, or like we keep getting into like different development programs. And so, it also like there is only so much we can do. There are only so many development programs we can go to. Like, how else do we show executives that, we are skilled, that we're here to tell these stories? And so it is then for the decision makers to build these programs that is like, all right, like, what do you think we're missing? Build that into this, show, or build this into this, and like that it goes into then actual success. So, it also has to go beyond like, okay, and so now you're going to get to shadow on this, show as well. So like, you're going to direct shadow for like 5 different, and like, you don't get to direct at the end. So it's still kind of that, oh, here's a little bit, but like, you still don't get that end goal. And so it is that more holistic approach to, we have to have that support from the industry, because we face barriers. And so therefore it is up to the decision makers to work with us, to look at the report and be like, how do we tell these stories, but also to build those systems into place that then are helping us to get to that place where it's like, okay, then I will be the showrunner, I will be the writer or director. And so like, there's that aspect of understanding, because we can't build that within a network, they're the ones with the power. So that also has to be done in collaboration with us to get us to that next stage.
For sure. I want to turn over to some of the, I know we've already started having some conversations about some of the stereotypes that are quite problematic, with Arabs, with Muslim representation. Leonard, I want to turn to you in terms of some of the representation you've seen on screen recently or in the past that, has been concerning you or troubling you as a creator.
Well, I mean, first, thanks for having me on the panel. It's, I mean, I will say it's nice that they let Asians being played by Asians now, so that's an improvement. Because like speaking to like Oda's point earlier, yeah, like I don't need to see Asians on screen if they're played by Mickey Rooney. Like that doesn't make any sense. So that's nice, but you know, it does get to it speaks to the issue of representation versus authenticity, right? Like where, yeah, we see ourselves on screen, but like, is this who we really are as people? And then you do end up getting a lot of like white stories with yellow faces, right? Or brown faces or whatever. And that's not, and it's a disservice, not just to the community, but just to the art of storytelling. Because like the thing with storytelling is you can say, the more specific you are, the more universal the stories can be, right? So I think that's something that that has to be tackled a little bit better, right? Yeah, Emma Stone or Scarlett Johansson, says Kim. But yeah, like I think that you know, and it does go back to what everybody has been saying. It comes back to like having people who can, execs who have power, who understand story and understand the need for authenticity, who can then greenlight these things. So like people like us who have been trained as storytellers, but can then be elevated to a position where we can make a difference. And you know, the reason why it hasn't happened is because it's just a systemic thing, right? This is the reason why like there's so few people of color in places of power anywhere. It's just because white people got a massive head start, right? It's like we're all playing Monopoly, but like they started with Park Place and Boardwalk, and like, you know, when women pass go, they don't get $200, they get 164, and like, you know, and like, what did Asians get, right? Like we built the railroads, that's what happened, and then we don't even own them.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. We can get into that a little bit more. Yeah. Do you want to speak a little bit more to the conversation around model minorities as well?
Yeah. So, you know, there's often a perception that, you know, all Asians are doing great, right? Like they're well behaved and they fit into society and therefore they're successful, and like and it's used as a cudgel by those in power who often are like, hey, look, if you just are more like them, if you know, than to other races, if you're just more like Asians, then everything will be fine, which is ridiculous. And it's also, you know, it's damaging to Asians who aren't all doing well, right? Because we're not a monolithic group. Like, you know, there's different diasporas within like the greater subset, like the set of, you know, Asian, and not everybody's doing well. Not everybody is economically, financially, professionally, whatever, successful, and then not all of them get the help that they need, unfortunately, as a result of that. So the model minority myth can actually be very, very bad, and that's another thing that, you know, those are just more stories. That's the thing, right? There's so many different types of stories and experiences within each community that it's hard to really get all of that out there because there are so few opportunities. Because it's like, oh, and a network's like, they're like, well, we get one Asian show. So what's that one Asian show going to be about? And then of course, people see this one Asian show and they're like, oh, that's how Asians are. Versus, you know, there's like what, 1 billion white shows. So it's like, so yeah, so like we got Modern Family on the one side, sure, that's one type of experience. You got Breaking Bad on the other side, that's another type of experience. But like Asians have that too, right? We got our Breaking Bad, like #1 meth dealer in the world was Asian. Go Asia. I'm gonna call him Shanghai Heisenberg.
Yeah, and I think Luisa, you mentioned that a little bit about with a show like Narcos and how that sort of like holds, you know, the Latinx community in terms of, do you want to speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think, you know, it is that cultural specificity. It's like, you know, it's great for us to get these specific stories, but I think executives also need to have that cultural competency to see beyond that. You know, the POC story is going to be the trauma story. It's going to be like, you know, the oppression story, because time and time again, like I was mentioning, I think there was a period of time of like about 3 years where there were about 5 different Pablo Escobar films that were making the festival rounds. It's like, how many more times do we need to be told the Pablo Escobar story? Like, it is interesting, you know, but then it just feeds into this negative stereotype. Like, you know, I myself am Colombian, and, you know, I've had chats with people like, all they say is like, oh yeah, Pablo Escobar. My dad started a job a couple of years ago, and his nickname at the workplace was Pablo. No one asked him like if he was, this is what he wanted, but it's this where like the only thing that people know about Colombia was that. And, you know, this is hurtful. This is, you know, doesn't take into consideration, you know, there's the comedies, there's the love stories. And, you know, exactly what you were saying, Leonard, is like, there's only one show and only one show will be told. And somehow the default is always the trauma stories. And we have so much more than that. And just because I myself as a Colombian are telling a story does not mean that that is what I want to do. And so again, like going back to like executives need to understand that. Like I was so happy when Encanto came out. It's like, you know, here's a positive representation of Colombia. It's beautiful. It's just a nice story. Happens to take place in Colombia, and you get to see, you know, some of the animals and fruit and just clothing of the people there. Why can't we have that more often? And so it is, again, going back to like, we need to be part of those decision makers to ensure that, you know, we see the value as like, here's a really silly rom-com. That's it. Doesn't get into like the trauma, doesn't get into any of that. It's just happens to be a POC creator that wants to tell a fantastic rom-com. And I do not think we're afforded those opportunities. It's always, we have to kind of justify through our backgrounds, like, oh, this is why I deserve to tell that story. And this is not something I find that white creatives, you know, face, but rather it's like, oh, great, you want to tell that story, go for it. And so, you know, we need to just be seen as great storytellers rather than like, oh, here's a really good type of storyteller because they're telling that story. It's like, our stories are just good stories, period.
And to the point, like when you're talking about rom-coms, just reminded me of Always Be My Maybe. I don't know if you've seen that, but yeah, with Ali Wong and Randall Park. And it was like, there's so many Asians in that story. And the nice thing about that is like, sometimes like the characters, if you have like a movie and then there's like the one Asian character, they're thought of as the Asian character. But in this, because there's so many Asians, it's like, you know, that's not the Asian character. That's just the flighty girlfriend character, right? Like you know, and that's I think what we need to get to, where we're not defined, our characters aren't defined by what we look like, but it's defined by who they are, which is what storytelling is.
Yeah. Hoda, sorry, I think you raised your hand.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I think we've seen, or I'm guessing the research shows that audiences are loving shows that have that authentic voice, that diversity, and whether it's, you know, a Kim's Convenience or sort of, these are shows that are both, and we talked about this last time, Shant, they're shows that are both broad enough in appeal to be relatable to wide audiences, but they are also revelatory because they come through that very specific, unique story lens. And I think that there's absolutely an appetite for that. So, you know, in a lot of the work that I've done on the documentary side, which has been around challenging stereotypes around Muslims, the audiences that watched my films before they aired were so surprised to find that they could relate to the main characters who were Muslim, and they just couldn't believe it. I mean, that was such a big part of the Q&A. But at the same time, they were really happy to get this very intimate look into a world that they don't often see represented in the larger, broader media, if you will. So the appetite is there. It's just, you know, to Luisa's point and Leonard's point, let us tell our stories. We're the best ones to tell our stories. How do we see ourselves? Not, you know, not the Pablos in the stories, but ourselves. Like, where am I in that TV landscape? I'm a Muslim. I'm an Arab Canadian. I'm not seeing myself. And I'm sure the rest of you would probably agree to a certain extent.
Yeah, for sure. I want to turn the conversation over to, you know, the sort of like the buy-in that we've seen in the industry in the last couple of years. We've had people say, yes, we are underrepresented on, you know, these spaces, these elements, and therefore we want to work hard to do better. You know, we've seen that across our national funders, Canada Media Fund, Telefilm, CBC, you know, but I'm curious because we're now seeing all these new programs, all these new funding streams specifically that were, you know, sort of set up, I think, in a sense to address Leonard's point around sort of generational wealth, right? Where, you know, all these Asians built the railroad, but do they own equity in that? You know, it's like, it's another conversation about like, okay, where's all that wealth going? And that wealth has generally been going, you know, to primarily white people in general. And in our industry, producers and filmmakers who have been making films for a long time. So now our people are coming into this industry or have been in this industry, but have been struggling for a while. There are these new streams that are coming up where they're saying, okay, great, you can apply for the mainstream, or you can apply for the, you know, some people call it racialized stream or people of color stream or whatever you call it. How has that navigation been? And yeah, how's that navigation been? Hoda, why don't you start off?
Yeah, so great. It was great news, very exciting. But what happened, of course, and it probably unanticipated, certainly by me and perhaps by funders, was how oversubscribed it was. So instead of, and these funds are prorated, meaning that depending on the number of people that apply by that certain deadline, that pot of money is divided between them. And so by going to a racialized program, at least in the first instance, you know, we received probably a third of what we asked for, which makes it really, really difficult to figure out how to move that project forward. And I remember thinking, oh, I could kick myself. Why didn't I just apply to the regular program? Because then I may not have been prorated. So that's an equation that still needs to be sorted. It was a bit frustrating, I have to say, very disappointing.
For sure. Yeah, I'm curious if that's the way to go. I mean, Luisa, how are you feeling about, like, should we continue to build separate streams? Should we rather focus on a singular stream that has a bit more attention focused on, you know, identity and diversity?
Yeah, I mean, I fully see the reasoning behind having separate streams, but it should all be part, to me, of a process that leads to just having one stream, because we can't keep being othered. You know, this is still tokenizing our stories, like, oh, well, this isn't the mainstream story, but we're just going to give you like this little bit of kind of like diversity money. And like, that's not it. That is sending the wrong message to the industry, where, you know, it's like this story only got funded because the person looks a certain way, because they identify a certain way. And so while, you know, there is that generational wealth gap, obviously this has to be addressed, but then we have to work towards, you know, bringing us into the mainstream, because our stories are mainstream. You know, these are stories that everyone can relate with. And so it is, again, just building that program. And then it is, you know, up to the funders, like they have to show that they're here to support us. And it goes beyond just like taking it like, yep, here's our diversity program. No, how do you get more diverse creators in? And that's not just through that othering stream. It's by empowering us to be, you know, to get the most money possible, to get our stories off the ground, rather than like, you know, there's 10 of us going for one fund, as opposed to like all of us could have gotten the funding the other way. So it is, again, that what is the end goal of this? Money right now is great, but how do you get us to that next stage where we don't need to be that like separate entrance into the industry?
Sure. Rabiya, I want to turn to you in terms of, I know we've sort of been having a conversation a little bit about specifically CMF's PPRC program, and specifically pre-development.
Oh, yes.
The world of pre-development. I'm curious, you know, I think in the last iteration, CMF sort of opened it up and said broadcasters can submit as many LOIs as they want to. How do you feel about that? Did that create an environment that maybe was less competitive because, you know, as Luisa was saying, your identity was your sole metric in terms of getting your funding, or partially the metric to get the funding?
Yeah, so so I do not love this separate streams situation. And I feel like that because when we look specifically at pre-development at CMF, right? Like if you apply through the regular stream, I think you're eligible for up to like 46K of like funding. But if you apply through like the diverse stream, you're only eligible for up to like, I think 25K of like pre-development funding. So already there's like inequity there. And it's just like, what are you really saying when people go and apply to like, the diverse stream? And as Hoda was saying, like, and you're already only getting like 1/3 of what you asked for. So it's like 1/3 of like 25K, like it's pennies. It's literally pennies compared to what people who go through the regular stream would get. And I think like, I'll just speak to like the Bell Fund, like Slate Development Program, like they just have one stream, but they prioritize people who come from like, marginalized backgrounds. They're making a big push for like women, but we can unpack what that means maybe later. That's a whole nother conversation. But I think just prioritizing marginalized, like producers, marginalized production companies in that regular stream, I think is a way better method to go, rather than like putting aside this like little bit of money, being like, hey, look, we care about diversity. It's like, no, you don't, because you're giving us half the money that you get in the regular stream. And then there's this whole conversation about staying at pre-development, but yeah, I'll leave it there. Yeah.
For sure. Go ahead.
I was just going to add, I mean, to both Luisa and Rabia's points, I think that the funds are important because it is a stepping stone and it's creating a gateway. But ultimately, I have to imagine the goal is to put us all in the same bucket so that it's all the same metrics. And there was another point that I was going to make that completely escaped my mind. So I'll come back to it. I apologize.
No worries. Leonard, was there anything you wanted to add before we move on to the next topic?
No, I think most people covered it. I think it's nice to have that for now, but it should not be a long-term solution. It's like, you put out the fires that need putting out, right? And then you build. But that's, so right now, yeah, people of color, we have not traditionally had the budgets, the know-how, because again, it's the historical inequities, right? But once that's been, well, I mean, it's never going to be truly fixed, but optimistically, once that's been fixed, then we can just become part of greater society, which is how it always ought to have been.
For sure. And I guess, when interesting term you used, Leonard, greater society, or just let's say mainstream for simplicity's sake. We have, I think as creatives have always sort of, or generally have been boxed into a box that is outside of the mainstream. And so therefore we've seen things like Narcos and Pablo Escobar stories and, Middle Eastern stories centering around terrorism, or, all that kind of stuff. But now we're seeing things shifting, obviously, like even with something like Never Have I Ever moving into more of a sort of like broad audience appeal story. So I'm curious about, when you're telling your stories, how are you thinking about audience? And how are you thinking, are you thinking about the community that you're representing being the audience for your story, or are you thinking about a broader audience? Rabiya, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think when it comes to like telling our own stories and like thinking about the audience, like it may be for better or for worse, but I don't think about broad audience appeal, because it goes back to, I can't remember who said this specifically, but like the more specific your point of view is, the more general appeal it really has. And I think there's so many shows that like back up this point. And it's like, as long as you're speaking authentically to like your own experiences and like, your perspective and your point of view on things, like the audience will be there. And I think I feel like it can be very detrimental to the creative process when you're like, oh, but like we'll like Tim from like Oshawa like this show. It's like, no, who cares about Tim? It's okay if Tim doesn't get this show. And like this is I think a lot of streamers have said this in particular. It's like that they don't want like middle of the road shows. They want to have polarizing shows, because the people who really like it like love it like so much, and the people who hate it will hate it and they'll find something else on the platform. So I think like leaning in to stories that like, we wish we saw when, like, that I wish I saw when I was growing up, or that like I wish I could see on screen now, or that I feel are like missing. And I'm like for me, like I'm Pakistani, I'm queer, I have like a lot of intersectional identities, and it's just like queer people always end up with white queer people. It's just like, it's like, why can't there be like a love story between like BIPOC queers? I don't know. Anyways, but I just feel like, you know, be true to yourself and the audience will come.
For sure, for sure. Leonard?
Yeah, I think like, you know, jumping off what Rabiya said, like, it's not, whenever I'm writing a story, like, I'm not thinking about, like, I do think about the audience, obviously, because like, you know, I want to make money, but but at the same time, like, good storytellers, they look like all the details, you know, that come from, you know, us or very specific things, but like at the end of the day, I'm looking at, well, what is the emotional core of the story, right? So yeah, so Tim from Oshawa, like, he might not know what it's like to be, you know, like queer, BIPOC, whatever, but he knows what it's like to be alone. He knows what it's like to want love. He knows what it's like, you know, and as long as, you know, like, the point is like to be able to speak to true human experiences, and that's our goal, right? And that's what we're trained to do, and so yeah, like, ideally, you know, the dressing doesn't matter as much as, you know, as the fundamental like core of the story. And I think that's, yeah, human condition. It's universal.
Sure. I know we do have to shift into the audience Q&A, so I'm really excited about that. Before we do, Hoda, I want to mirror or echo your statement about the difference between how executives look at stories that are relevant to their audiences versus stories that are revelatory to audiences. And how those revelatory stories have been the ones that we've seen win the awards and the ones that have been centered and receive the praise or get people excited and get people intrigued and want to learn more. Naming Sort of as, you know, best comedy at the Canadian Screen Awards on Sunday is a great sort of button to this. So with that, I'll jump into the Q&A. Do we have any questions lined up, Kelly Lynn?
There were a couple. So I think the person asking for a consultant, that might be something to take offline. Someone's asked, how do we decide who writes our stories? And how do we measure the competency of the person's writing, research, and knowing? Actually, there's a lot of questions into there, but maybe.
Right. This is someone anonymous. I was our story. So I can just say the full statement. How do we measure the competency of the person's writing, research, and knowing? On the other hand, a show like Kim's Convenience, pretending to be Korean accent when they're Canadian, feels a little inauthentic since we are trying to move towards authenticity and steering clear of stereotypes. How are we gauging the storyteller's competence to the culture from all aspects, writers, actors, etc.? Leonard, maybe why don't I'm going to rephrase that question a bit more and just sort of talk about, yeah, what sort of a question that we had earlier, sort of what tools do we have in our toolbox that we can sort of gauge to say, okay, you know what, this is a cool story, and this is how I'm measuring that this person is the right person to tell this story. I'm curious, you know, what are the markers that you would see for an executive to greenlight a show?
Well, the funny thing is there's a difference between a good story and an authentic story.
Right.
Because like you can craft a great story that's completely inauthentic, right? So, you know, so for an exec or like who understands story, they could probably be like, yes, this is a good story. This ticks all the boxes, great, you know, midpoint, whatever, all the exciting is where it's supposed to be, blah, 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 whatever, right? Like it's
right
there. But in terms of authenticity, I think if they don't know, they should ask people who would. I mean, they can't just go like, oh, based on their own experience. Like they just need more Asian friends, basically. And they just need people they can ask, be like, hey, does this make sense to you? And it is hard, it's tricky, right? Because like, if I'm reading a story about a culture I know nothing about,
right,
I'm probably gonna be like, if there's like sufficient verisimilitude, I'm not gonna question it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But I think if you do greenlight it,
Yeah.
You're like, oh, the story's good enough and it seems authentic enough, but you should then have it vetted after that to make sure
Yeah.
that when it gets to screen, it's
Mhm.
as authentic as it should be.
So is that some form of like, I'm hearing some people write in consultants, some people, focus groups, or even
Yeah.
like you were talking about like socializing amongst, I mean, if it's an Asian story, do you have Asian friends? And obviously not everyone is relevant to each story, right? So it doesn't necessarily, just because you have one Asian friend and they're like, what do you think of the story? It's like, I have no idea what you're talking about,
Yeah,
that can
exactly.
still be the case, but definitely tools like just checking in with everybody, checking in with the community. How about let's say that, checking in with the community.
Check in. Just
Check
check in. Just at least make the attempt. Even if the attempt fails, at least it tried, right? Like at least that's the mindset they should have. Because like if they're not making the attempt at all, that's how a lot of stuff makes the screen where it's like, what? Like this would never happen. Like this is insane.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to add to that in terms of gauging authenticity? What is something more authentic than another? Like how do we gauge that?
Well, I'm just wondering, in addition to what Leonard was saying, shouldn't one of the creators or one of the people in the writer's room be from that community that, to bring that authenticity? Like, to me, that would be a very key part. Like, yes, absolutely check in with the community, focus test, all of that. But it seems like in your core team, you need to make sure that you have that person who has that lived experience.
For sure. I think we're seeing a lot more of that, especially with Barry Average's comments last week. Luisa?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that as well, that 100%, Hoda, what you're saying at that beginning stage, like someone from the community should be part of this core group. But once it goes to the next stage as well, not relying just on this one person to tell everything about the story. And so it is the planning, it is the steps. And so it is getting, cultural consultants. So to ensure, like, obviously, is this a very personal story? Then yeah, this is only their point of view. Like, or is this, encompassing other aspects of people's experiences? And so it is just doing the work, like you're giving all of this money to create this, hire a consultant, do research, like, it's been mentioned, like the focus groups already, but also don't just put it on the one creative to then like be like, this is, the Latin American experience or this or that. It is just also then creating, like a
Collective.
team. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. That is insurance. Like, yeah, like we're hitting this, and also just like talk to the company. Like a lot of different companies as well just have, a lot of members from different communities. So like, bring them in, just like have people voice their opinions and share this. So, I think it should be very community focused, but also the creators have to be given the tools to ensure that they are crafting stories that are authentic and representative.
Great. I'm going to sort of end us off with one final question. It's just sort of summarizing, a lot of people have been asking sort of like, basically, I think overall career advice. How do I get my show made? How do I get started? How do I make the connections to get the jobs I need to then get my show made, down the road? So I'll just give everyone a quick opportunity to sort of give a little tidbit of advice on how to navigate this industry a bit, bit more, and then we'll close it out. Hoda, why don't we start with you?
Sure. If you have a good one and you don't have the haven't developed the connections in the industry, make it your homework to find out who are the production companies that are making shows that speak to you. Go to them, pitch to them first, establish a relationship. And if you can find partners or colleagues that are willing to work in that collegial mentorship way, that's, to me, a really great path to take. I also think that buyers or decision makers, at least in my experience, seem more open today than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when we were trying to make diverse type content. Those doors, at least in my experience, were just not open. But today, those doors have opened a bit like more. And so you can also try and go directly to the broadcaster or the streamer, the platform. But partnerships are good, especially if you haven't wended your way yet through the industry. Do some homework and find out whose work you like and go from there.
Lisa?
I think, yeah, that's exactly it. And it's also leaning into your community. It is just, there's a lot of, I find, willingness to help each other out. And, you know, that understanding, like, we're not competing against each other, but we can build each other up. So when you're starting out and you don't know something, reach out. Like, you know, you want to be, you know, a camera operator, like, just, you know, put the ask out there. There's a lot of different Facebook groups as well that are for this, where like people will tell you the resources. And so I think the main thing, like, how do you get in? You ask, you build relationships, and that's how, you know, your, for example, like your slate is not going to be greenlit the first time you talk to an executive, but like it is building those relationships where they know who you are. Maybe they're like, oh, you mentioned that like you're super into like a space opera. We're working on that right now. Would you be interested? But it's also saying what it is that you want to do. And so like, don't be afraid to like reach for what you want to be like, oh, okay, well, this is the only thing I can get. But just when you're having those conversations, even if you're not there, letting people know what it is that you're looking for, because they're going to keep in mind when an opportunity comes like that, but also returning the favor as well. So just like, you know, us helping each other is like the best way to just like keep growing within the industry.
I'm going to quickly turn it over to Joan.
I just want to say it's really important not to get stuck in the emerging purgatory of, you know, going from one program to the next, to the next, to the next. You can be there for a very long time. I think BIPOC TV and film and BSO and other organizations are really working hard to start the relationship with the decision maker before we bring people in. So for example, we're working with Bell Media right now on a bilingual anthology series. Well, we had Bell say yes first and put up their money first, and then we brought people in, and we need to do much more of that. And I think what you can do is just to keep in touch with us to see what we're developing, and because that's primary on our mind, is to give the communities agency and the opportunity to tell their stories now that the doors are seemingly open.
Rabiya and Leonard, I'm going to give you 30 seconds. I'll start Rabiya with you.
I think everyone's made great points so far. I think it goes to that age-old saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So having a community who you can turn to and like help you is A1. And then also becoming a producer on your own projects. I highly, highly recommend having those skills, having those credits. Yeah.
Leonard?
Yeah, you know, community, great. You know, rising tide lifts all boats, blah, blah, blah. But also work on your craft. That's the one, there's only so much you can control. Work on your craft. Like, don't rely on gatekeepers. You don't need a gatekeeper to tell you to write a script or 10 scripts or whatever. Get good, because that is sharpening your machete and it's a jungle out there. So.
Loving that. You've made a lot of cool references, or just like interesting ways of phrasing things. Anyways, with that, I'll finish up and hand it back off to Kelly Lynn.
Sorry, my dog's gonna bark. So thank you, everybody. I just want to talk to bring it back to the research for a second. Say that, so we've got the directives, the People of Color Communities report, which launches today. The directives of a start of a conversation or a continuation of this conversation. And after, the next ones coming out are going to be the Black Communities report in early May, then 2S LGBTQIA+, I'm getting better at saying that, in late May, early June, and people with disabilities for late June. And we encourage you not just to read it, but share it. Share it with, you know, everyone you know, regardless of their backgrounds. This is all information and education that we all need.
Thank you.
I was going to say, again, really focus on the directives. They are, you know, short, easy to read guidelines on how to tackle each of these issues without, you know, we want everybody to read the whole thing, but if it's easier just to give them a part, those directives are what that's for.
Sounds great. Well, thanks everyone. I think we'll close it off there. Let's stay in touch in the sphere of social media, Twitter, Facebook, etc. And hope to see everyone soon in real life.
Thank you.
Thank you.